You are listening to Leaders and Legends, a podcast featuring some of Indiana's most fascinating men and women whose impact has shaped our state, our communities, and us. Join us as we discuss their imprint on our history. Leaders and Legends is brought to you by Veteran Strategies Incorporated, your local veteran business enterprise specializing in public relations, media relations, public outreach, crisis communications, and digital photography. My name is Robert Vane, Principal of Veteran Strategies, former Deputy Chief of Staff to Mayor Greg Ballard, and Communications Director for the Indiana Republican Party. I'm honored to be your host for our discussion. Thank you for joining us on the Leaders and Legends podcast. Our guest today is Brian Payne, say the whole thing because I always forget it. I always get it wrong.
It's really hard, but I'm the President and CEO of the Central Indiana Community Foundation.
Thank you. Way to start, Robert. We appreciate your time and are excited. For today's conversation, we're joined by Danielle Shockey, CEO of Girl Scouts of Central Indiana, and all-around rock star. She really makes these podcasts better, and I'm glad that she could join us today. Danielle, as always, take it.
To be here, absolutely. So Robert got that name with your help, CICF. It's also better known as. So for our listeners, Brian, tell them in that really short elevator answer, if you will, what is CICF and what is its importance in our community?
So CICF, Central Indiana Community Foundation, is a community foundation. Now, a community foundation means that we are a public foundation and we're a 501c3 and we do three things. We're a grant-making organization. We are a philanthropic, charitable giving, resource counseling support organization. And we do that through having 500 at this point, in growing, family funds, where we're supporting families in their philanthropic dreams. And then the third thing that we do is we're a community leadership organization. We have kind of use our very privileged position of kind of being networked into the whole community and kind of seeing what different sectors are doing. So a lot of times we're the only organization that is in a room where there's 7 different conversations all about Central Indiana, but from different sectors. We're the kind of the glue that's maybe in all 7 meetings. And so we have a unique perspective that sometimes can lead to a kind of a new idea or sometimes to champion someone's idea who needs partners to champion a good idea.
Okay. So I want to break that down to like the dummies of community foundations, if you will, for listeners. Because frankly, there's a lot in that answer that you could unpack. Yes. Any one of those 3 parts.
You told me to be short.
Well, I did. So now I'm going to ask you to be long. Okay. and explain kind of the history, like just the idea of a community foundation and why this one has existed as long as it has, and kind of that genesis of its purpose.
Yeah. So the history of community foundations really goes back to Cleveland in 1914, the very first one. It was created by David Rockefeller's banker, who ran the Cleveland Trust Company, a guy named Frederick Goff. And he had 2 reasons. One was that there used to be these old, what they called dead hand trusts. There was these trusts that were legal. Like first, the main example always in Cleveland is at the time, 1914, that there was like this a lot of money that someone set up to help people like pioneers that were moving through Cleveland, heading to pioneer the West, like in the 1800s.
Okay.
But in 1914, and so someone put a lot of money to be hospitable in Cleveland and help people in Calistoga wagons, like heading west. But in 1914, there were no Calistoga wagons heading west, but there was money that was only good for that. So it was just sitting there doing nothing. And the idea was a community foundation could be a structure that could actually, in a very responsible way, with good stewardship, unleash those old trusts that were just sitting there and doing nothing. That was one of the ideas. The other idea is it was an awesome business model for banks in which you could, and this is a little pejorative at the time, but you could get your wealthy clients to give money to a community foundation, have your bank manage that money in perpetuity, and get a really healthy fee on the management of that money. So it was both a good business decision and a good community decision. And this idea quickly spread. I think Rockefeller's banker had a lot of network. And so in 1915, 3 or 4 cities created them. In 1916, we created one with 3 or 4 other cities in the country, and now there's 800 community foundations. And I think the key thing about a community foundation is, if you look at the world of philanthropic foundations, right? There's Lilly Endowment in our town, of course, and there's the Nina Mason Pulliam Trust and Crystal Lahan and the Fairbanks Foundation. Those are all private foundations. And that money came from one family or maybe a person. Our money comes from thousands of people over generations. So, in fact, we have to meet a public support test. If we got too much of our money from one person or one family, we would actually no longer be a public foundation. We would have to cross over and be a private foundation. And of course, there's corporate foundations where the money comes from a corporation. So our money comes from the community, and all those foundations are serving the community, but we're really dependent upon, lots of gifts of $25 and $100 and funds that open up at $25,000 or $100 million. But it's really, we need the community to support us as then we try to support the community.
And so that's on the receiving side, right? So that's where all the support comes from for the greater good of the greater community. And so I know right now, here recently, you've certainly energized what it is CICF wants to then use these resources for.
Right.
How do you come to conclusion with this most recent, I don't even want to call it a campaign.
Well, it's really we changed our mission.
Please,
So we've been really clear, which we have to get the word out, that we don't just have a new strategic plan. We have actually changed the mission of our foundation. The mission we've had over the last 20 years has served us well, and it makes a lot of sense, or made a lot of sense. Our mission has been, we inspire, support, and practice philanthropy, leadership, and service in Central Indiana. And that was really concise and really accurate. What we've discovered through just a ton of data is that, and this is not just Indianapolis, this is every community, but some of our challenges are we have one of the lowest upward mobility rates of any large city in America. If you take the 50 largest cities, we're 47th out of 50 in upward mobility. So we have this situation where if you're born in poverty, and this is all of America, but we are trending worse than other big cities. If you're born in poverty, you're most likely to stay in poverty. You're much less likely now in this country in 2019 than in the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s of the 1900s of not doing as well as your parents or surpassing your parents. So these are the parts of the American dream, right? This is the American dream, that the next generation can do better, that anyone through hard work can lift themselves up and succeed. But the data is very clear that that's not happening right now, or it's not happening to the way it used to. And so that's what we looked at, and we saw that there's this huge opportunity gap. The other third data point is with that upward mobility, race, and racist systems play a huge part in keeping that mobility down. So we changed our new mission is we mobilize people, ideas, and investments toward creating a community where all individuals have the equitable opportunity to reach their full potential, no matter their place, race, or identity. Now, place is about zip code because that's how everyone thinks about poverty. Is if you're born in a zip code, in a zip code that's low income right now, it's really hard to break out of that. And there's lots of reasons for this, including, I think, how networks have, I look back at all the jobs I've had since high school, and there's only one out of, say, 9 jobs where I got on my own to just responding to a want ad. Every other job, someone in my network let me, played a role in me getting that opportunity. And there's a lot of people who don't have the networks of opportunity. Mm-hmm. So that's kind of where we're going. But again, that's a new mission. We expect that to be our mission for the next generation or two. And so that's a bold new world that we're entering into.
So when you look at the pool of resources of the foundation with this new mission and dedication to the work that you're going to do, the dollars that you're going to expend to help us achieve that, to your point, for the foreseeable long-term future, midterm, long-term, how does that get? So I'm Girl Scouts of Central Indiana CEO, right? We seek grants to help further our mission.
Right.
So people, organizations come to the foundation and say, I have this idea. I want to make this systemic change. I think it's going to make a huge difference. And if it meets the criteria, so kind of talk about that other side of then how you are this conduit and I don't want to, truly a conduit, a pathway to making sure that the dollars are serving the better part of the community around this mission?
Yeah, great question. So we're about $830 million in assets. But you have to take a look at where those assets kind of, where do they sit within the foundation. So out of the $830 million, the Indianapolis Foundation part of us, which created CICF along with the Hamilton County Community Foundation, formerly known as the Legacy Fund of Hamilton County. So those two foundations representing Hamilton County and Marion County created CICF in 1997. And we all exist. Sometimes the Indianapolis Foundation kind of loses its brand and CICF kind of trumps it in Marion County, but they all still exist. And the Indianapolis Foundation has its own $140 million endowment. We call that the endowment for Indianapolis. So if you spend 5% of that $140 million in grants, that's $7 million a year. So overall, the world of CICF grants about $55 million a year. $7 million of it is our own money that my board and I and my staff, we control that money. That's $7 million. We control that. I'm going to come back to that to answer your question. But we give $55 million away. So the Glick family has a donor-advised fund with us, and the Ephraimson family, but 500 other families do. And so there's tens of millions of dollars coming from those families that are part of CICF. But our job, the money is legally ours, but it's morally theirs. Right? So the Glick Fund or the Ephraimson Fund, and they decide where they want to put their money. We have to approve it, but as long as it's legal, we'll approve it. But our job is to make their philanthropy better for the community, more meaningful, more thoughtful, but also better for their own dreams. And so there's a lot of money moving out that way. Now the super sauce. The secret super sauce of a community foundation is when we have an initiative or they have an initiative and we see that we both care about the same initiative. So sometimes the Glicks will say, we're really interested in this Far East. They have a Far East Side strategy. They're transforming the Far East Side. There's a huge challenge there, but they have made incredible progress on the Far East Side, very meaningful change. And no one else, there was no momentum on the Far East Side. There was no there for a while.
How are you defining Far East Side?
So 38th, 42nd, Mythhofer, post Mythhofer, German Church.
John Marshall.
Yeah, that's not, it's broader than that. Yeah. Those are some of the kind of
significantly challenged.
Yeah.
And the city's actually trying to do good work there.
It is. And the city has, the city's partnering. I would say that the Glicks, through their commitment, the reason why they're so committed there is they have a lot of their, first of all, Gene and Marilyn, when they first built their homes back in the 1950s, it started the Glick Company. It was on the Far East Side, their first homes that they built. But to this day, they still have... The original
suburbs of post-World War II.
Yeah, that's right. And they still have... really, significant apartment buildings that they built over the decades, and so they're really they have a lot of tenants and living in these apartments, and they want to help those tenants have a more opportunity and more assets, and there's always people assets, right, in every neighborhood, but we're talking about kind of infrastructure assets or like there's no university there. There's no what we call the anchor assets. Mm-hmm. There's no big anchor institutions. Like the Children's Museum is such an important anchor institution on the north, at 30th and Capitol, 30th and Illinois. They're a huge player to make that part of our neighborhood structure have more opportunity because what the Children's Museum can bring.
And the impact of the closing of Fort Harrison. Although there was significant, the Fort Harrison reuse people have done a terrific job, but it's not like it was. I was stationed at Fort Harrison for a while, and you have all these officers and enlisted men and senior NCOs and all that sort of thing, all living. They can't all live on post, right? And so when I came back from the Army, I lived at 21st and Post, Marina Apartments. Sweet.
Yeah.
And you just drove around and you're like, this is different than Irvington. It's the East Side, but it's different than Irvington where I grew up. It's noticeable. It was noticeable, and this is 1990, so 39 years ago.
Yeah. So that's just an example I was giving about. So what will happen? So it's not always that we're going to fund holders and saying, hey, would you co-invest with us? Sometimes we co-invest in them. That's a mutually beneficial relationship. But the power is when we both are concerned about something, we can co-invest. I mean, go the Cultural Trail, which was an idea that I had in 2001. The first two significant funders were Murdopolium individuals. It was Murdopolium, Lori Ephraimson. It was 90 Mason Polium Charitable Trust and Lumina Foundation. But Lori and Murda had funds with us. And then the Glick family came in with a $15 million contribution to really give the juice to the Cultural Trail to get really great momentum about building all 8 miles. They had a fund with us. Now that doesn't mean I couldn't spend their money, but it meant I had the relationship that I could go to them and have a serious conversation about how the Cultural Trail could connect into their own philanthropic values and priorities. So that's so there's all of that. But the Indianapolis Foundation, which we do control directly, has $7 million it can give away, and we've decided that we're going to have in this next 5 years anyway, 51% of that, so a little bit more than. Well, actually, $1 million goes to the libraries through a library fund. It's a little bit more restricted. So we have $6 million that's not library funding, and 51% of that $6 million will go to any not-for-profit who makes a proposal that we think is compelling and good for the community. It doesn't have to match our initiatives, though it probably have to speak at some level to opportunity, equity, and inclusion.
Sure.
Okay, but the other 49%, a little less than $3 million, is going to support our initiatives in our strategic plan that are around economic mobility, family stabilization, dismantling systemic racism, criminal justice reform, and neighborhood empowerment placemaking. So that money is like in partnership. Now, like when the Girl Scouts, if they have this idea, it's like, oh my gosh, they would be an awesome partner with that idea. We should partner with them, not just grant to them or to you, but partner with you on something. Then that can come also could come out of the 2.9 million as opposed to the 3.1. So that's how we kind of strategize all that. But you might have something and we say, gosh, you know what? We just don't have we love it. We don't have the money, but you know what? This family is exactly zeroed in on what Danielle's talking about. Let's get her in front of this family. We have to do a better job of that. We do that well with a small number of families. We're trying to scale through technology, and we're trying to find systems that make that happen way more. And it doesn't just depend on, do I have the time to connect you to a family? That there's actually systems that are advocating for that.
Sure.
You're listening to Leaders and Legends, a podcast presented by Veteran Strategies, a local veteran public relations enterprise, and sponsored by Girl Scouts of Central Indiana, the Crowne Plaza Hotel and Grand Hall and Conference Center at historic Union Station, and MacAllister Machinery, your friendly neighborhood Caterpillar dealer. You mentioned the Glicks earlier. Eugene Glick, you see his name, but most people don't know his story. His story is absolutely phenomenal. Not only is he an IPS kid, he went to Shortridge, I think the same time as Vonnegut. I think they were contemporaries, Kurt Vonnegut. We need to do a Kurt Vonnegut podcast, actually. But he also documented the liberation of Dachau concentration camp. He was at the Battle of the Bulge. What was it like to be involved with him, to know him and understand how much he loved his hometown?
Yeah, it was an incredible privilege, though my timing was a little off personally. I mean, when I was at the IRT, that was my job before this. So I moved to Indianapolis from California to be the managing director of the Indiana Repertory Theater from 93 to 2000, and then I came over here in 2000. Now, Gene really wasn't involved in the IRT, but every once in a while, I would get this beautiful handwritten note that would say, Brian, I saw this play or something. I couldn't see the play, but people have told me, the play was awesome, and I just feel like what you guys are doing at the RT is really important, and I hope to try to get more engaged. I mean, and we get so excited, there was Gene Glick, knowing that we, existed at the RT. But I found out later, which is in no way to despair, is that Gene would sit down with a staff person or someone he engaged, as a contract person who had beautiful handwriting. But Gene would sit, he'd sit there and he would dictate notes. And so he would be sending out, 5, 10 notes. I don't know how many exactly, but a number of notes every week like that. But I just thought that was awesome, and that was kind of my bridge to him. And then when I got the job at the Community Foundation, I got invited. I was one of the many people that would get invited every once in a while to break bread with Gene. So 2 or 3 nights a week, he and Marilyn would invite people in the community out to dinner to break bread, to have these conversations. And I got the chance to do that 2 or 3 times. By the time the Cultural Trail came around, my first couple pitches were with Gene, but as it got kind of the level of seriousness around a $15 million gift, he had kind of deferred that to some of his own team. And Gene was starting to slow down a little bit at that point. So I did get the great privilege of being with him when he was still, super robust and vibrant and this incredible businessman and community engaged person. I wish I had an earlier decade of that. One of the big honors of my life was I was asked to be part of. I guess I represented the not-for-profit sector at his memorial service, and I told the story about how the Cultural Trail was first introduced to him, and this is the way I remember it, is that Gene had this. He wanted to do like some version of St. Louis Arch or the Seattle Space Needle. And so he would invite people in, to have lunch with him at 2:30, by the way, at MCL in Broad Ripple. When I had lunch with him, which was only a couple times, I had dinner with him a couple times and lunch, but I had to have lunch before I had lunch because I couldn't wait till 2:30 to have lunch and be sharp, and try to.
Because there was that Riverside Tower that they proposed over at White River for a while. Do you remember that?
I don't remember.
It's going to be
that.
This 1,000-foot tall, roughly. Kind of.
Oh, in White River, yeah. Well, yeah.
There's this huge tower that they talked about was all limestone or whatever, and it kind of went away. Is you vaguely familiar with that?
Yeah, I am. Yeah, actually, that just came up in conversation recently. It was a Cesar Pelli. It was like a super famous architect who was young back in those days who had this idea. And I think they ended up doing a version of that tower in some other city in Europe or something when we didn't execute on it. But Gene, so I think maybe Gene was inspired by that. I don't know if he was involved in that, but Gene was, I want to do something that honors great humanitarians who made the world better through peaceful pursuits as opposed to war heroes. Because he was, like, as Robert said, he was so involved in World War II and major moments of World War II. And he felt like war heroes got their due. But what about the people who made life better through every day, like innovation or through literature, like Mark Twain or Jonas Salk? Jonas Salk was always his kind of example. I want to honor people like Jonas Salk.
Because he grew up in the polio generation.
Yeah, right.
That was the great fear.
Yeah.
And Franklin Roosevelt obviously exemplified it as president that you could overcome it. But for his generation, it was the great, oh my God, please not let my son have or daughter have polio.
Yeah, yeah. So Gene wanted this big, thing, and so on his memorial service, I exaggerated the story for effect, but basically he would call not-for-profit people in and have them pitch their idea, and the way I talked about it is that he'd call them in and they'd pitch their idea, and he'd look at them and say, "Off with their head." Like we were like the court jesters coming in to the king and pitching this idea. And so that's how I felt when I pitched the Cultural Trail to them, to him at the first time. And I didn't get, off with his head, but I didn't exactly get a round of applause
either. Knighted either?
I didn't get knighted. That's right. Good point.
So is that the genesis of the Peace Walk?
It is. It is the genesis of the Peace Walk. There's
the Peace Walk is between. Is it Capitol and Illinois?
It's between Illinois and Senate.
Right.
Two blocks. Really beautiful part of the Cultural Trail that incorporates Gene and Marilyn. Gene's idea of honoring people through peaceful pursuits, and then Abraham Lincoln and Martin Luther King are downtown as kind of markers to the Peace Walk that has 10 humanitarians. And then there's the two that are downtown, one by the convention center and one on Washington and Virginia. That's Martin Luther King, and then Abraham Lincoln's by the convention center. That's really how we kind of built Gene's idea in to honor, what he wanted and one of the ways we ultimately pitched him and his team was, instead of copying other cities and doing a 500-foot tall Space Needle arch, let's do a 50,000-foot linear trail that people can use every day, and instead of just going up to the Space Needle every once in a while. My oldest friend lives in Seattle, and we were together for the one weekend we get to see each other every year. And I asked him, when's the last time you went to the Space Needle? He lives in Seattle. It's like, I think it was when you and I had dinner there like 25 years ago. The Space Needle's awesome, but it's not like you make it part of your everyday life if you live there. The Cultural Trail, if you live downtown, can be part of your everyday life. So that's it. But we wanted to also honor his peace idea.
The Cultural Trail is probably the most identified part of downtown that isn't specifically about sports or military.
Mm-hmm.
As someone who is on it on my bike every day and wave to you as you come past me with your Pacers bike share bike, what's it like to have the kernel of an idea for something that transforms connectivity in the mile square and beyond, but downtown, and to see it come to fruition? What's it like can you think of the first day where you went, hey, what about this? And then to the last time you walked or rode on it?
Yeah. It is a wonderful feeling for me, and I met my wife Gail working on the Cultural Trail. I'd met her before, but we fell in love working on the Cultural Trail together. So there's a huge legacy in my life of the trail. It was it was just 11. It was 11 years of work. If someone had told me up front, by the way, Brian, I think you can do this, but it's going to be 11 years, I would have said, no, I'm not spending 11 years. I thought it was going to be 5 years of work. I was prepared to spend 5. But when we got all done, we actually really missed it. I mean, it was like we went through a withdrawal, not just Gail and myself, but our whole team, which we had become great friends, this kind of core of the team. And so it was so much fun to work on. When it was done, it was like, wow, that was so much fun. We were going to find anything as fun as that as a project. So it's incredibly fulfilling. I do remember. So the trail has been all done, really 99% done was done by the Super Bowl in 2012. And there's a little bit of additional stuff in 2013. And then in May of 2013, we had this awesome, that Gail and Mindy Taylor Ross, another friend and teammate.
Rock star, Mindy Taylor Ross. Rock
an
star.
Amazing project manager, amazing art curator. She's working for people all over the world. She's working for Cummins all over the world. She's incredible. And Gail and Mindy co-produced this kind of day-long celebration with 80 arts organizations all over the trail. It was an amazing kind of capstone. And it was like 2 weeks later, or maybe it was a year later, and we walked out of our building, our office here at CICF at North in Alabama, and it was a beautiful day like it is today, and there's lots of people on the trail, and then we were seeing some of the new development on the trail. And it was this moment, it's like, wow, the trail has actually lived up to all of its promises. And we had a lot of promises. I mean, we had high expectations, but it actually has overlived. I mean, it has actually over-delivered on its promises. But I remember that one night, just that magical moment where Gail and I looked at each other and it's like, wow, this project that we worked on and met on and we dreamed up, it really worked. And it actually has a bit of a legacy. Now, at the time, I never doubt that it was. I always said, we will work through any challenge. And now when it was all done, you look back and say, well, that was really naive. And now I'm really humbled by looking back about the amount of good luck, actually serendipity. And now that the fever has broken, I'm actually being rational about the trail where I wasn't when I was in the middle of it. It's like there's so many things that could have, with the same amount of effort, that could have derailed that. And somehow every time we needed a break, we got a good break. And so how did that happen? It's like, wow, I don't know. It's just like really,
let me ask you about
really fortunate.
Let me ask you, and I'll ask one more question, then let Danielle take over. recently recorded a podcast with Paul Okeson, who was former chief of staff to Greg Ballard, and Mike O'Connor, former chief of staff, senior deputy mayor for Bart Peterson. And I asked them, in previous people who had worked in the mayor's office, you talk about what you did, but there are specific things that people will say, when I see X, it reminds me of my time in the mayor's office. Joe Loftus said the mall. For me, it would be the Irvington Charter School, because when they closed the Guardians home, and this is so Greg Ballard, they closed the Guardians home. They decided not to send people there. I grew up across the street from the Guardians home. I went to Mayor Ballard and said, did you see they're closing the Guardians home? We've got to do something. We can't let that sit empty in the heart of Irvington. And Ballard, without looking up, goes, well, do something.
I know.
So I walked into Krieger Rausch's office and said, let's figure something out. So that's what I think of. And other people talk about this. I was involved, David Harris, charter schools off the charts. His podcast is upcoming with us. But navigating the world of politics to get something done is not the easiest thing in the world. It may be easier in Indianapolis. Matter of fact, I would argue it is easier in Indianapolis. But in 2007, mayors changed and the parties changed. How did you navigate that both before and after? And what is your impression overall of how people come together in Indianapolis to do the right thing?
Yeah, boy, we got Mayor Peterson to, green light the cultural trail. And I remember Jane Henniger, deputy mayor, now the incredibly effective head of our ACLU of Indiana. I had worked through the mayor's office. I started with my friend Kira Amstutz, who had a role in Mayor Peterson. She was kind of the arts and cultural liaison.
She's terrific.
Yeah, so I started with her. I worked with Melina Kennedy on the economic development. I mean, she was the head of economic development for Mayor Peterson, and 3 or 4 others before I ever went to Bart. And I knew Bart really well, but I wanted to go through and get enough momentum before I went to the mayor. And then he delayed it. He delayed it for a year which made sense, because he was trying to convince the state legislature that Indianapolis was broke so that he could combine, the township governments. I don't know if you remember that. IndyWorks. And so he said, look, I really like this project, but I can't, even though we're not putting any city money in it, we're going to help you raise money from the feds and all that. But even though we're not putting any money in it, I'm not going to be able to convince the state legislature that we're a city that's financially broke. And then they say, well, how are you building a $50 million trail? And he said, even though I can say that's not our money, it's just it's too confusing to get that point across. So we had to delay that through IndyWorks, went through. And then I remember Jane calling me up and said, can we have lunch today? And I said, yeah, what's up? And she said, I just need to talk to you. And I knew that lunch was either going to be thumbs up or thumbs down. And I had been working on this for 5 years up at that point. And when she said the mayor is going to green light this project, it's one of the happiest moments of my life. And then, so we had a green light from a mayor. And so when he lost to Mayor Ballard, and I don't know if, Robert, if you remember this, I remember it. So I'm watching that on TV, and I am very concerned because I don't know anything about Greg Ballard, right? Because no one knew anything about Greg Ballard the night that he won.
Imagine that.
But it was, oh my gosh, it was and I like him. And so it's our county prosecutor, Carl Brizzi.
Brizzi. Yes, when he said no more this and no more that. So
Carl Brizzi was, the Mayor Ballard's party was at the Mira, Old National.
On election night, yeah.
Yeah, his victory party. And Carl Brizzi was in the parking lot being interviewed. And it's like, yeah, well, there's a new sheriff in town. There's a new mayor in town. We're not going to do anything like this stupid trail stuff. I mean, I'm not watching on TV. I'm already very, very concerned that I have to now deal with the new mayor that I have no idea. And his, not his official spokesperson, Robert was his official spokesperson, but someone who was speaking on his behalf was basically pointing to the cultural trail and saying, none of this stuff. And we only had a half a mile done. We had raised the money for the next 4 miles, and we needed to raise money for the following 3 or 4, but we had only completed a half mile. And so if a new mayor is like, I don't like this idea, forget about it. I mean, I really was super concerned that was the end of the dream that night. But Mayor Ballard, being, someone who was, always prided himself and lived this idea that if it's good for the community now and 50 years out, I don't care who gets the credit, I'm going to do it, And it took him a little while he never did anything that, once he became mayor, that made me concerned. But it took him a little while to actually fall in love with the cultural trail, but he ultimately did. But then, ironically, he became the best mayor in the country for Greenway trail connectivity, multimodal transportation. Ironically, we couldn't have gotten a better mayor that would support everything. And that's another piece of great fortune the trail had.
Well, that's exactly right. And what people never really, it took them a while to understand about Greg Ballard is that he had lived all over the world through his service in the Marine Corps. So he saw how Paris and London and Stuttgart and Manila and other places did things. And he brought so much of that back to Indianapolis, whether it's bike lanes or bike trails or electric cars and that sort of thing, that he was much more cosmopolitan and certainly much better traveled than most, if not all, mayors. And so I think it's safe to say that Bart Peterson deserves an A+, and Greg Ballard deserves an A+.
I would agree. And the trail would not have happened if it wasn't for both of them.
And Brian Payne deserves an A+. And
well, thanks.
Many folks do.
Sure. Well, and I want to stay on the transportation vein a little bit, but move away from the cultural trail if we might. So in doing research to get ready to talk to you today, read about some, I guess maybe dream vision you have next around mobility and individual mobility and maybe some technology integration and the future. Talk about, because we're now seeing the red line, we're living some new things in our community, but what is your vision so it really helps people be lifted up and have all kinds of access?
Right. So it's called the Personal Mobility Network is the project. And actually, the very first person there's like too long a story about how kind of the data and the different conversations connected into this idea. But the very first person I mentioned it to was Mayor Ballard at Zubilation. I saw him at Zubilation, and you have 2 minutes to talk to 1,000 people.
2019?
No. This was back when he was still mayor. So this is back to, so what are we talking about? 2015, maybe.
His last year's mayor.
Yep, maybe 2014. And, you get 2 minutes to talk to people at Zubilation, 1,000 people, 2 minutes each, or 100 people, 2 minutes each. So I got my 2 minutes. I said, hey, Mayor, I just was thinking about this. Let me pitch it on you. And he was like, yeah, I think that has, and he had some ideas about it. We had this nice, really conversation. That was the first person I socialized it with. So fast forward 4 years. And so the idea is, now everyone is, every city, not every city, but many big cities are looking about how to, take what we've learned from Uber and Lyft and take it to another level of information, real-time information on apps. Okay. Now, 4 or 5 years ago, not every city was thinking about that, but they are now. But here's the secret sauce of Indianapolis is I think there's an opportunity not just to provide information about how to travel in different ways through different modes, combining modes, but because we're a community where everyone works so well together, is that I want, like, for example, if you look at our assets, it's all about looking at our assets. We have the cultural trail. We have great bike infrastructure. We have a really, really effective bike share. We have Blue Indy, the first of its kind, and still not too many cities have anything like that. And that still plays a very important role. We now have the Red Line. There's Uber and there's Lyft out there too. There's the scooters. Now the scooters, I know I wasn't supposed to mention scooters to Robert. That was a pre-show note. Do not mention scooters to Robert Vane.
Just don't mention them being on the left on the cultural
trail.
Well,
yeah. So the scooters, I was very excited about how the scooters could play a role in this. Now I'm very not excited about how scooters are being operationalized, how people are abusing, how the whole scooter world is not a respectful one. It's not a safe one. But if we could get people to understand the positive power and act with a little bit of maturity about the scooters, then it could be a really positive asset. But this idea of where everyone else is looking to provide real-time information about how to access this stuff, we want all of these things to integrate and work to create a system. And then, of course, we'll deliver the technology. Ideally, a single pay system where you could have like you could have an account on your phone. But we also have made a decision, and there's a lot of partners on this. I mean, there's all the partners you'd expect, but then we were able to recruit Tom Linebarger, CEO of Cummins, to chair a corporate advisory committee, which has created a ton of momentum. And John Lechleiter's on that. And John Lechleiter's on the board of Ford Motor Company, which is a major player in this. So we have all this momentum. We have a major initiative with Ford. But the idea is to take all of that and focus on it as an equity play. Really make sure it works for people who cannot afford to own a car or buy a car. And if it works for them, then it'll work for everyone else. But we really want to make it work for them. And one of the ideas is to have like a transportation savings account. So as a veteran, could the Veterans Administration or philanthropy say, if you qualify as a veteran and you have a job and you need transportation assistance, maybe there's a $200 a month a subsidy that goes into your transportation savings account, which is on your phone. If you don't have a smartphone, we'll give you a smartphone. And now you can use that. And you say, okay, I'm living, in the Near East Side, and I need to get to my healthcare appointment at Eskenazi. And you just say, I need to go to Eskenazi. And it says, well, how, and you have this default about how you want to travel and how you manage your money. And so it says, okay, it's a nice day. I'll ride my bike for 1 to 3 miles, but then after that, I need to catch a bus or I need to Uber the last mile. And it's like, okay, you need to get to Eskenazi based upon your own preferences. Here's how you do it, and here's how much this trip will cost. And it just makes it seamless for everybody. And so we've got a lot of momentum. I mean, it's another big idea. It's going to need the good fortune the Cultural Trail had. I know even less about technology than I did civil engineering, and I knew nothing about civil engineering. So the technology kind of scares me, but it doesn't scare other people, and we've got really smart people on the team. Yeah. So we've already made a ton of momentum, and we've got Indigo and the Chamber and Central Indiana Corporate Partnership and the MPO and the Mayor's Office and Veterans Affairs are all partners with us, and we might just pull it off.
So I have a daughter with special needs who someday will need transportation. She'll probably live semi-independently. But that idea of any kind of social networking opportunity that gives her access and people like her, right? I think there's so, and to your point about the transportation spending account, how exciting could that be? Take that one step further. Whether that's subsidies for other groups of people.
Right. And one of the as we go back to our mission about opportunity for all, we're also paying attention to people with disabilities. How do they reach their full potential? How do we create a community that enables them to reach their full potential? And transportation for people with physical disabilities is a real challenge. And so we're working on that too. We haven't forgotten about that.
That was part of the Cultural Trail.
Yeah, it was. We won some major awards. Greg Fairbach played a huge role.
He's so great.
And we've won some major awards for for how accessible it is with people for disabilities. And Greg was Greg and he had this lovely woman who was his associate who played a major role too.
So what year? If you were going to bet on this coming to fruition, what do you think? 11 years from now?
No, I never think beyond 5 years. So 5 years.
Awesome.
5
All
years.
right.
We could pull this off in 5 years.
Yeah.
Could blow up tomorrow too, but we hope to pull it off in 5 years.
We're rooting for you.
Thank you.
You mentioned upward mobility earlier, so let me tie a couple things together. You recently spoke at the IPS Equity event. The State of the District speech by the superintendent, Alicia Johnson, mentioned that quite a bit. Racial equity and pulling together to try to have more upward mobility, better education options. Why do you think it is so important to emphasize education beyond kind of the platitudinal answers? But you've been involved. You've worked with so many leaders from so many organizations. Do you believe education sets people apart in terms of opportunities? And how would you describe the landscape of both educational options and racial equity here in Indianapolis?
So before I spoke today at the IPS Racial Equity Summit, I sat in on one of their workshops for an hour and a half. That was learning, a teaching from the Racial Equity Institute. And they showed pretty much in any city in the country, and they showed it for Indianapolis, just every outcome is negative for African Americans versus white people in every outcome, including, but not just education, everything, health, life expectancy, infant mortality, education, unemployment, everything. Every system has been somehow evolved and designed to work against Black people and other people of color. So I do think education's super important. I think we made the mistake that many people made back in the 2008. We had a college readiness and success initiative. And at that time, Lumina was doing, and we all were doing this. Everyone was doing this. That was where we were at that moment. And
it's part of the tech boom.
Yeah, I think right. I think everyone got
take advantage of the new economy, and to do so, you must have X number of years of college or X number of degrees.
That's exactly right. That if you weren't part of the knowledge economy, you did not have a future. I remember thinking, oh my gosh, what jobs, if my son didn't go to college, what jobs could he have that actually he could make a living? This is kind of the thinking of 2007, 6, 7, 8, whatever. That was an overreach. Now I think it's important. Certainly education is a huge, creator of opportunity for many people. I think we need to think more broadly. I think we are, not just we CICF, everyone's thinking more broadly about education being, post-secondary skills attainment, or, it's not, for a while we thought everyone had to get a 4-year degree, right? This country thought everyone had to get a 4-year degree, and we were part of that thinking. And now I think it's I'll give you an example. I had this incredible I have some lot more to learn about it. But my friend Diamond Hargis, who is this incredible Black neighborhood leader that lives in between MLK and Clifton on 33rd. And Diamond has basically taught me a ton of things over the last 10 years, and he's actually really informing a lot of our work in the neighborhoods. He's a special advisor. And he and one of our CICF neighborhood ambassadors, Wildstyle, who's Diamond's neighbor, the three of us wanted to do a road trip, and we went to Cincinnati. Did for a 24-hour road trip, spent the night, had dinner, had awesome conversations. But Diamond also introduced us, and Wildstyle and me, to his good friend, a guy named Peter Block, who talk about a legend. He's a legend in the world of organizational development. He has worked with Exxon and, Bell Labs. He's been a guru. He's 80 years old, still super incredibly wise and sharp. And we had breakfast with him, and we've had follow-ups. Peter got us a special tour and site visit of something that Cincinnati has called the Hip Hop Cultural Center. Now, what I knew before then about hip hop was almost nothing. What I know now is a little more than nothing, but I'm studying up on it. But here's my point about the Hip Hop Cultural Center, is that first of all, Peter said, look, here's how we changed the game. We asked Black kids, 16 to 24, Black youth, 15 years ago, after the Cincinnati riots. They had race riots, right? Mm-hmm. This was a result of trying to do things differently in Cincinnati after a crisis, after a race crisis. We've never had a race crisis, thank goodness, but sometimes, a crisis is, a terrible thing to waste. So Cincinnati didn't waste their crisis. So he, instead of assuming what Black kids might want or how we think they need to engage in education as white, well-meaning, educated people, he turned the tables, and he and his team went out and they asked a ton, a large number of Black kids, what do you care about? What are you passionate about? What are you good at? What do you want to do? And a majority of the answers was something that was hip hop culture. So it could be, graffiti, but if you look at graffiti in a more positive way, visual arts, laying down beats, being a DJ, being an MC, dance. these are all the things that this does. And these kids now are doing it because they're passionate about it. Since they're passionate about it, they're really good at it. And now there's all these transferable skills. So people are getting jobs. They're getting jobs as graphic designers because they started studying graffiti in a more serious way. They're getting tech jobs because if you can lay down beats on a sophisticated sound system, that's software and technology and how to operate all these things, and they're getting tech jobs. So I think what we really do need to think of as, especially well-meaning white people in power, is what is broaden the kinds of skill sets and education and think about it in a different way. And for me to think about it in a different way, I actually need to have people of color around me teaching me to think about it in a different way. So I think education is, awesome. It's incredibly important, but I think we need to be more flexible and more broad and more adaptable to how we think about the educational experience.
And I should disclose they're my client, but IPS emphasizes the 3 E's: employment, enlistment, because too often the military isn't thought of as a real, not just an honorable thing to do, but as a real springboard to the next phase of your life. And I mean, there's too many examples to mention.
Yeah, the skills that you acquire, right?
And the last one would be enrollment in a 2 or 4 year college,
or a 1-year certificate program now, possibly.
Yeah, and you've had some of the best industrial arts or career and technical education facilities in the state, right down the street at Arsenal Tech and other places. We have time, Danielle. Why don't you ask one more question, and then we'll get to the 5 questions. What's your best question you haven't asked yet?
So actually I want to tie a couple things together. So I heard Alicia Johnson speak, and so this isn't an IPS question. Actually, I want you to tie this question to the work of the foundation. She gave the analogy or the imagery of a lake, and on that lake is thousands and thousands of dead floating fish. And she made the connection to say we would never look at that, or most of us would not look at that and say what was wrong with the fish, but we would say what was wrong with the environment. And I feel like what the foundation is doing is saying what is in our environment and our community that is causing the lack of opportunity, equity, and inclusion. And therefore what you're doing, in my opinion, is trying to get at the root causes and make changes. So I guess my question in all of that is, we've talked about education, we've talked about transportation. What else in this lake pond analogy would you say is, in your mind, one of the top priorities outside of education and transportation to make a huge foundational community difference?
It's a great question. So, pretty much every system, what we've learned through the data, what we've learned through hanging out with really smart people like Alicia, and also the Racial Equity Institute, where she's learned that metaphor from them,
it's a great picture.
It is a great picture, right? I mean, one dead fish in a lake, it must be the fish's problem. 100 or 1,000 dead fish, that's a lake problem. That's a water problem or an ecosystem problem. We have an ecosystem problem in this country when it comes to people of color. It's the systems that are broken. It's not the people that are broken. So in this first 5 years, criminal justice. Criminal justice is probably, we weren't going to do criminal justice. It was my staff who, on a draft of our strategic plan, we had already 4 major initiatives. I already thought it was, at the time, the most ambitious strategic plan of any not-for-profit I've ever seen before. And then this next draft has, and we're going to do criminal justice reform. And I thought, you're killing me, people. How are we going to do that? That's huge. And the answer was, we can't say we're going to dismantle systemic racism if we don't deal with the most racist system of all, criminal justice. I mean, I'm heartbroken about this news. I mean, yesterday in Fort Worth, where a wonderful, highly educated young black woman who was babysitting her 8-year-old niece was shot in her own home by a nervous police officer, a white officer who's now resigned today, but that doesn't bring her back, right? So criminal justice is the biggest problem. So we're working on that. And but you mentioned them. You mentioned transportation. We think transportation is huge because if you can't get to opportunity, there is no opportunity. Affordable housing we believe that's important, but we believe it's especially important near transit stops. So we don't have enough money to make a huge dent in affordable housing. It's such a big problem, but we could make some dents and make sure that there's affordable housing near red line or blue line or purple line stops. So we're going to focus on that, and have already made some investments. Education, workforce development. We have some donors. This is way back where donors have influenced us to focus on infant mortality. We haven't done a lot about health that's just not our expertise, but why are we working on infant mortality? Because its outcomes are incredibly unfair by race. So people think it's class, but women of very high income, like $75,000 or more, have the same infant mortality of white women, black women of $75,000 or more, same infant mortality rates of white women who make under $20,000. So at the highest level that they mark of black women of the highest level of incomes have the same infant mortality of white women with the lowest incomes. But then when white women go from $40,000 to $40,000 or $60,000 or $80,000, infant mortality gets to be really quite rare, but not for black women. Why is that? That's not black women's fault, right? That's something in the system. So we're looking at that too, and there's incredible work going on at IUPUI's. Both at IU Health, all the health systems here, but also the Fairbanks School of Public Health. Incredibly good stuff, but we think we could be helpful. So those are the systems now. If we can make inroads, and we're very clear, we have made. Even though I have trouble looking beyond 5 years, the foundation is saying we are in this for multiple generations. This is our new mission for the next 20, 40, 60 years until we dismantle systemic racism. But even though that's really long term, I see meaningful positive change every day. And the fact that people are talking about race, the Chamber and CICP, Central Indiana Corporate Partnership, have both said that we have now made it okay to talk about race. And that's you got to talk about it to learn about it. You got to learn about it to change it.
You are listening to Leaders and Legends, a podcast presented by Veteran Strategies, a local veteran public relations enterprise, and sponsored by Girl Scouts of Central Indiana, the Crowne Plaza Hotel and Grand Hall and Conference Center at Historic Union Station, and MacAllister Machinery, your friendly neighborhood Caterpillar dealer. We have come to the end of the podcast, and we end the podcast with the same 5 questions. Are you ready?
I'm ready.
Question 1, what was your first job?
A dishwasher at a restaurant.
Which
My sister got me that job. That's one of my network jobs. I wanted to kill her for getting me that job. It was a horrible job. It was in Eastern Washington. Long story.
What was your first concert?
I think it was James Taylor, but I'm not 100% sure. It's the one I remember.
You don't remember it?
I was late to the concert world. It's not something I went to. I didn't do that in high school. I wasn't that into music in high school. But
I bet you are now.
I am big time. I know. I'm big time into music. I remember the first time I was really excited about going to concert was James Taylor at San Diego State in like a 4,000 seat amphitheater with a pretty girl. Not Gail, because I didn't know her then, but that's what I remember about my first concert, whether it was really my first concert or not.
If you could suggest any book for someone to read, which book would you recommend?
I think if you asked me that a year from now, it would probably be different. But right now, I would recommend Just Mercy. We were talking about that before the podcast, which is by Brian Stevenson, and the movie's coming out. It's actually at Heartland Film Festival, but it's coming out in December. Go see the movie, but I'm sure the book will be better than the movie. It always is.
If you could witness any event in history, be there as it happens, which event would you choose?
Martin Luther King Jr.'s speech in Washington. I have a dream speech.
Last question. If you could have dinner with anyone living today, 2 hours off the record, whom would you choose?
Barack Obama.
You are hitting the big giant middle of the Venn diagram. There's a lot of the same answers, and I think it proves that how reasonable this city is. and the people in it. There are always fringes, but there are a lot of people who are choosing the same. I think the most popular answer, Spangle, forgive me, is the signing of the Declaration of Independence, but the MLK speech has come up several times, and it's amazing how like-minded people are when it comes to trying to find something reasonable. Our listeners may or may not have heard of the Indiana Historical Society's Living Legends event and program, and honors people who are living Hoosiers who have made a difference. And on the list, people like Larry Bird and Mark Miles and Allison Millangton and Jim Morris, and also a person who was kind enough today to hang out with us, Brian Payne. His legacy is all over the place. And while you may only recognize part of it in the cultural trail, it is much broader and deeper than that. And we only hope your participation in our city grows and continues.
Oh, thanks. A great honor to be with you. And Danielle, great to see you as always. And Robert, keep up the good work. Very honored to have this conversation with you.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, Danielle.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Thank you very much for listening to Leaders and Legends, brought to you by Veteran Strategies Incorporated. If you want to contact us about this program or our menu of public relations services, please send us an email at robert@veteranstrategies.com. That's robert@veteranstrategies.com.